I need to see your identification.
Why are you asking for my ID?
Because you are being detained while we investigate.
On a quiet stretch of desert highway, far from any checkpoint or border crossing, a woman stood beside a vehicle packed with the ordinary fragments of a life in transition. Within minutes, flashing lights fractured the stillness. Federal agents approached with questions that quickly hardened into demands: proof of belonging, proof of identity, proof of citizenship. Her answers were steady, but the presumption of doubt lingered longer than the dust in the air. What followed was not a routine stop, but a chain of decisions that would transform an isolated roadside encounter into a national civil rights case. The stakes escalated almost immediately. A citizen insisting on her status faced detention in her own homeland, while official authority operated on suspicion rather than verification. Documentation, procedure, and discretion collided in real time, captured by recordings and later dissected by investigators. The encounter raised a fundamental question about who must prove their right to exist in public space, and at what cost when institutions get it wrong. Months later, the legal system would weigh evidence, accountability, and the price of a mistake measured not only in dollars, but in trust. The desert highway stretched across the horizon in a line so straight it seemed almost drawn, a corridor of asphalt cutting through muted earth tones and low scrub brush. Midday light flattened the landscape, leaving little shadow and even less sense of distance. On the shoulder of that road, a single vehicle sat still, its trunk and back seat visibly crowded with boxes, blankets, and the loosely arranged belongings of someone in transition. And the stillness of the setting carried the quiet rhythm of routine travel, interrupted only by the sound of wind passing over open ground. The encounter began without spectacle. A marked enforcement vehicle slowed, then stopped behind the parked car, its presence transforming an ordinary roadside pause into an official interaction. Two federal immigration agents approached with measured steps, their posture signaling authority before any words were exchanged. What followed unfolded methodically: questions about identity, travel, and purpose. The woman answered calmly, explaining who she was and why she was there, but the conversation quickly narrowed to a single demand: verification of citizenship. The shift in tone was subtle, yet decisive. The agent's posture hardened as uncertainty replaced routine inquiry. The remoteness of the location amplified the imbalance. There were no passers-by, no nearby businesses, no immediate witnesses beyond the open sky and the distant hum of occasional traffic. The woman remained beside her vehicle, separated from the familiarity of movement, and placed instead into a moment defined entirely by official discretion. As the exchange continued, procedural steps began to take shape. Identification was examined, communication devices relayed information, and the agents conferred briefly, their body language conveying deliberation rather than resolution. The woman's insistence on her citizenship status did not bring closure. Instead, the interaction deepened into a formal stop, the kind that carries consequences beyond the roadside. Time seemed to compress as routine turned into decision. In the presence of enforcement authority, combined with uncertainty about verification, created a narrowing path of options. The agents informed her she would be detained pending further confirmation, a step that transformed the encounter from questioning to custody. In that moment, the ordinary objects in her vehicle, evidence of travel, change, and personal history, stood in silent contrast to the institutional process unfolding beside them. As she was placed into the enforcement vehicle, the desert returned to its stillness. But the trajectory of the day had shifted irreversibly. The stop on that quiet stretch of road marked the beginning of a chain of administrative and legal events that would extend far beyond the horizon, turning an isolated encounter into the foundation of a national civil rights dispute. Long before the desert roadside encounter, her life followed a rhythm familiar to those who navigate multiple worlds at once. She grew up within a native community, where identity was not an abstract concept, but a lived inheritance, shaped by family ties, local traditions, and the geography of land that carried memory as much as meaning. Her citizenship was not something she contemplated daily. It existed as an unquestioned fact, reinforced by documents, civic participation, and the ordinary routines of work, travel, and community life. In the months leading up to the stop, she had been in transition. The belongings packed into her vehicle reflected a period of movement rather than instability. Boxes of household items, personal records, clothing, and keepsakes gathered as she relocated temporarily for work and family responsibilities. And the arrangement was practical, not chaotic, a mobile snapshot of a life reorganizing itself. Like many Americans navigating economic and personal shifts, she relied on long drives across rural routes, where distance is measured in hours and solitude is expected rather than unusual. Her daily life was grounded in small, consistent patterns: regular contact with relatives, participation in local events, and the responsibilities of maintaining employment while staying connected to her cultural roots. Those who knew her would later describe someone attentive to obligations, cautious in unfamiliar situations, and accustomed to explaining her heritage to institutions that often misunderstood or oversimplified it. The need to clarify who she was had surfaced before, in paperwork, in casual conversations, in administrative processes, but never with consequences that threatened her freedom. The road she traveled that day was one she had taken before, a route chosen for efficiency rather than isolation. Stopping along it was not an act of distress but a pause, an adjustment of cargo, a moment to check directions, the kind of brief interruption that rarely registers as significant. Yet, the visual of a vehicle filled with personal items, parked alone in a sparsely populated area, created a perception that would later shape official interpretation. This chapter situates her not as an abstract figure in a legal dispute, but as a person whose life contained the same practical concerns as millions of others: managing change, maintaining stability, and moving between obligations. The contrast between that ordinary context and the extraordinary escalation that followed underscores the central tension of the story. By the time federal agents approached her on the roadside, she carried with her not only documents and belongings, but the quiet expectation shared by any citizen that routine movement through public space does not require justification. Immigration enforcement in interior regions operates within a framework that blends national policy with on-the-ground discretion. Far from border crossings and permanent checkpoints, agents often rely on situational judgment, interpreting context, behavior, and available information in real time. Training emphasizes vigilance, documentation, and adherence to constitutional standards. Yet the practical application of these principles can vary widely depending on circumstances. In remote areas, where encounters are less frequent and oversight less immediate, individual decisions carry heightened weight. On the day of the stop, the agent's assessment began with visual cues: a parked vehicle, an individual alone, and the presence of numerous personal belongings. Within enforcement culture, such observations can trigger further inquiry, especially in regions where agents are tasked with identifying potential immigration violations beyond traditional border zones. What begins as a consensual encounter can quickly transition into an investigative stop if officers believe they have sufficient grounds to question legal status. The threshold between routine questioning and detention, however, is often shaped by interpretation rather than certainty. Procedurally, the agents followed a familiar sequence. Identification was requested and reviewed, communication channels were used to verify information, and internal protocols guided the interaction. Yet, the process revealed a tension between policy and practice. When the woman asserted her citizenship, the agents faced a decision point: whether to accept available documentation as sufficient or to escalate the encounter pending further confirmation. Their choice to continue the investigation reflected a cautious approach rooted in enforcement priorities, but it also exposed the limitations of relying on immediate verification tools in the field. Institutionally, such decisions are framed as protective measures designed to ensure compliance with federal law. From the agent's perspective, uncertainty can justify extended inquiry, particularly when verification systems are inconclusive or delayed. However, the same discretion that allows enforcement to function flexibly can also create conditions where individual rights hinge on subjective judgment. In this case, the balance tipped toward escalation, setting in motion administrative steps that would later be scrutinized in detail. By the time the agents formalized the detention, their actions had shifted from investigative to custodial. Reports were initiated, classifications assigned, and the incident entered official record. What remained unresolved was whether the initial justification met the legal standards required for such a significant intrusion on personal liberty. And that question, rooted in policy but tested through practice, would eventually move beyond internal review and into the broader arena of legal accountability, where the authority exercised on that desert road would be measured against constitutional protections. Detention alters the perception of time. What begins as a roadside interaction transitions into a sequence of controlled movements, each step governed by procedure rather than personal choice. After being transported from the highway, she entered an environment defined by intake protocols, identity checks, and waiting. An administrative rhythm that can stretch minutes into hours. The physical surroundings were functional and impersonal, designed for processing rather than comfort, reinforcing the shift from citizen to subject of investigation. The initial phase focused on verification. Personal information was recorded, databases consulted, and internal communications circulated among officers responsible for confirming status. Despite her consistent assertion of citizenship, the process moved forward as though the outcome remained uncertain. The lack of immediate resolution created a psychological strain that extended beyond inconvenience. Detention introduced a quiet but persistent fear that institutional momentum might override individual truth. Communication with the outside world was limited and delayed. Family members and close contacts, expecting routine check-ins, began to notice her absence. Calls went unanswered, messages accumulated, and concern gradually replaced assumption. The logistical reality of detention, restricted phone access, unclear timelines, and fragmented information meant that those closest to her could only piece together events indirectly. Their search for clarity mirrored her own experience inside the facility, where updates arrived slowly, if at all. As hours passed, the emotional landscape shifted from confusion to apprehension. The routine elements of daily life, work obligations, travel plans, personal responsibilities, remained suspended, replaced by the singular focus on proving what she already knew to be true. Each procedural step, while administrative in intent, carried personal weight, reinforcing the imbalance between institutional authority and individual agency. By the end of this period, the situation had evolved from a temporary stop to a documented detention with lasting implications. The involvement of legal counsel began to take shape as relatives and advocates sought pathways to challenge the basis of her custody. The chapter closes at this turning point, where uncertainty gives way to the first structured efforts to secure her release and examine the decisions that led to her confinement, signaling the beginning of a transition from personal ordeal to formal dispute. The shift from personal experience to documented case began with records, devices, timestamps, and reports that transformed memory into verifiable sequence. Body camera footage captured the initial approach on the roadside, preserving tone, posture, and the progression of questions that led to detention. Dispatch logs provided a parallel timeline, noting when inquiries were made, what information was requested, and how responses were relayed. Together, these materials formed a framework that allowed attorneys and investigators to reconstruct the encounter with precision rather than recollection. Reviewing the footage introduced a new dimension to the story. What felt immediate and disorienting in the moment could now be examined frame by frame, revealing pauses, decision points, and the exact language used to justify continued questioning. Analysts compared these observations with agency protocols, assessing whether the escalation aligned with training standards. Small details, how long verification took, what alternatives were considered, and how uncertainty was interpreted, began to carry significant legal weight. Witness accounts supplemented the official record. A passing motorist who noticed the stop, as well as personnel involved in later stages of processing, provided statements that helped contextualize the event beyond the perspective of enforcement alone. These testimonies did not dramatically alter the timeline, but they reinforced the consistency of the woman's assertions and the absence of behavior typically associated with evasiveness. The accumulation of perspectives strengthened the evidentiary foundation of the case. As documentation grew, so did the clarity of the central dispute, whether the agents had sufficient grounds to detain a person who consistently identified herself as a citizen and presented identification. Legal teams organized the materials into a narrative supported by objective proof, preparing to demonstrate not only what happened, but why those actions might constitute a violation of civil rights. By the end of this phase, the encounter had moved beyond anecdote. It existed as a structured body of evidence capable of withstanding institutional scrutiny. This transformation marked a critical turning point, enabling the woman's experience to be evaluated within formal legal frameworks and setting the stage for the filing of a lawsuit that would test the accountability of the authorities involved. The decision to pursue legal action marked the moment the incident formally entered the judicial system, transforming a documented encounter into a constitutional dispute. After reviewing the collected evidence, attorneys determined that the circumstances surrounding the stop and detention raised substantial questions about unlawful seizure and violations of civil rights protections. The complaint was drafted with careful attention to chronology, citing the roadside interaction, the duration of detention, and the procedural steps taken despite her repeated assertion of citizenship. Filing in federal court required more than recounting events. It required translating personal experience into legal claims supported by statute and precedent. The lawsuit outlined how the agent's actions allegedly failed to meet the standard of reasonable suspicion necessary to justify prolonged detention. It also addressed the broader implications of identity verification practices, arguing that the burden placed on her to prove belonging represented a systemic failure rather than an isolated misjudgment. Each allegation was anchored to documentation, ensuring the case rested on verifiable facts rather than interpretation alone. Once filed, the case entered a public record accessible to journalists, advocacy organizations, and oversight bodies. Media coverage began to expand, not through sensational headlines but through careful reporting on the legal questions at stake. Civil rights experts weighed in on the implications, noting how similar encounters in remote areas often receive little scrutiny unless supported by clear evidence. The lawsuit thus became both a personal pursuit of redress and a focal point for broader discussions about enforcement boundaries. The government's response followed procedural timelines, with motions addressing jurisdiction, liability, and the interpretation of the agent's authority. These early legal maneuvers did not resolve the dispute, but clarified the contours of the arguments that would shape the case moving forward. Discovery requests sought additional records, including training materials and internal communications, widening the lens beyond the single encounter. By the close of this chapter, the conflict had shifted decisively from roadside discretion to judicial evaluation. What began as an isolated enforcement action now stood as a test of institutional accountability, with the court positioned to examine not only individual decisions but the policies and practices that informed them. As the case moved deeper into litigation, the courtroom became the primary arena where competing interpretations of the same events were examined with formal rigor. Pretrial motions narrowed the issues, defining which claims would proceed and what evidence would be admissible. The discovery process produced internal communications, training documents, and supervisory reviews that provided insight into how the agent's decisions aligned, or conflicted, with established guidance. Each filing added detail, gradually constructing a comprehensive record that extended well beyond the roadside stop itself. Testimony played a central role in shaping the court's understanding. Experts in constitutional law explained the threshold for reasonable suspicion and the obligations officers face when an individual asserts citizenship. Agency representatives described enforcement protocols, emphasizing the operational challenges of verifying identity in remote settings. The convergence of these perspectives allowed the court to assess not only what happened, but whether the actions taken met the legal standards governing federal authority. The process unfolded deliberately, reflecting the judiciary's role in weighing evidence rather than impressions. Throughout the proceedings, the evidentiary record remained the anchor. Body camera footage, logs, and written reports were introduced to establish a consistent timeline, while cross-examination tested the reliability of each account. The narrative that emerged was not dramatic, but precise, focusing on procedural decisions and their consequences. Observers noted how the case illustrated the gap that can arise between policy language and real-world application, a theme that resonated beyond the immediate parties. As hearings concluded, the court faced the task of determining liability and potential remedies. Legal arguments shifted toward the question of damages, considering both the tangible impact of detention and the broader civil rights implications. The progression toward resolution signaled that the dispute had reached a decisive phase, where the findings would carry consequences not only for those directly involved, but for institutional practices moving forward. As the case approached resolution, attention shifted from establishing liability to determining consequence. Legal teams on both sides assessed the weight of the evidence, the likelihood of prevailing at trial, and the broader implications of a court judgment. Negotiations unfolded against the backdrop of public scrutiny and internal review, with the financial valuation of harm becoming a central question. The damages sought reflected not only the hours of detention and emotional distress, but the principle that constitutional violations carry measurable cost. Risk analysis within the agency considered precedent and exposure. A protracted trial could amplify reputational impact, while a settlement might acknowledge error without extended litigation. These deliberations took place within a structured process, involving legal counsel, federal oversight officials, and budgetary authorities responsible for approving any payout. The discussions were methodical rather than adversarial, grounded in the recognition that the evidentiary record had established a clear narrative of events. When resolution was reached, the figure attached to the agreement drew national attention. The multi-million-dollar outcome signaled institutional acknowledgement that the detention had crossed legal boundaries. Financial compensation served a dual role, providing redress for the individual and reinforcing the expectation that federal authority carries responsibility when exercised improperly. While monetary awards cannot fully address the personal disruption experienced, they represent a tangible form of accountability recognized within the legal system. The announcement of the resolution concluded the formal dispute, but opened a wider conversation about oversight and reform. Analysts examined how the case compared with previous civil rights settlements, noting the factors that contributed to the scale of the payment. For the woman at the center of the case, the outcome represented validation rather than vindication, a formal recognition that her experience was not simply unfortunate but unlawful. By the close of this chapter, the financial settlement stood as a marker of consequence, illustrating how a single decision made on a quiet stretch of road can reverberate through institutions and budgets alike. The narrative now turned toward what, if anything, would change within the systems that allowed the incident to occur. In the months following the settlement, attention turned inward within the agency, where formal reviews examined how a routine enforcement interaction had escalated into a costly civil rights violation. Internal assessments evaluated field protocols, focusing on the threshold for initiating investigative stops and the procedures for verifying citizenship claims in remote environments. Supervisory panels analyzed whether existing guidance provided sufficient clarity, or if ambiguity had allowed discretion to override safeguards designed to protect lawful residents and citizens alike. Training programs became a central focus of reform discussions. Instructors revisited scenario-based exercises, emphasizing the importance of corroborating information before extending a stop into detention. Particular attention was given to encounters involving Native American citizens, whose legal and cultural identities can intersect with federal systems in ways not always fully understood by enforcement personnel. The case served as a reference point in updated curricula, illustrating how misinterpretation of context can lead to decisions with constitutional implications. Oversight mechanisms were also reassessed. Documentation requirements were strengthened to ensure that justification for detention is clearly articulated and subject to supervisory review in real time. Technology upgrades aimed to improve the speed and accuracy of identity verification, reducing reliance on prolonged questioning when initial documentation is inconclusive. These administrative adjustments reflected an institutional effort to translate the lessons of the case into operational change. Beyond the agency, policymakers and civil rights organizations monitored the reforms, viewing them as indicators of whether accountability would extend beyond financial compensation. Public reports and oversight hearings examined progress, reinforcing transparency as a necessary component of rebuilding trust. The broader conversation centered on balancing enforcement responsibilities with the protection of constitutional rights, particularly in regions where encounters occur far from public scrutiny. By the end of this chapter, the incident had moved from courtroom resolution to institutional reflection. While reforms cannot retroactively alter what occurred, they represent an attempt to ensure that future decisions are guided by clearer standards and greater awareness of the consequences when authority is exercised without sufficient foundation. The narrative now shifted toward the long-term personal and societal impact of the case. In the years following the settlement, the legal resolution settled into the quieter space of personal and communal memory, where outcomes are measured less by court documents and more by lasting impact. For the woman at the center of the case, daily life gradually regained its familiar structure: work routines, family gatherings, and the steady cadence of responsibilities that had been abruptly interrupted. Yet, the experience remained a defining reference point, shaping how she navigated public spaces and interactions with authority. Recognition of wrongdoing provided validation, but it did not erase the awareness that rights once questioned can feel permanently fragile. Within her community, the case became part of a broader conversation about identity and belonging. Tribal leaders, local advocates, and educators referenced the incident when discussing the complexities Native citizens often face when interfacing with federal systems. The story functioned as both caution and affirmation, a reminder of vulnerability, and an example of how persistence and evidence can produce accountability. Community forums and educational initiatives incorporated lessons from the case, reinforcing knowledge of legal protections and available recourse. Public perception evolved as well. Media retrospectives revisited the lawsuit, not for its financial figure alone, but for the procedural questions it raised about enforcement practices far from the border. Analysts noted how the case influenced subsequent reporting on similar incidents, encouraging more rigorous scrutiny of official narratives. The woman's experience, once an isolated event on a remote road, became part of a larger archive of cases informing public understanding of civil rights in practice. Emotionally, so closure arrived gradually rather than as a single moment. The conclusion of legal proceedings provided certainty, but healing unfolded through time, support networks, and the re-establishment of ordinary routines. The acknowledgement embedded in the settlement affirmed that the disruption she endured had meaning beyond personal hardship. It contributed to a clearer articulation of the limits of authority. As a story closes, the desert road where the encounter began returns to anonymity, another stretch of pavement among countless miles. Yet its significance endures in records, reforms, and lived memory, illustrating how a brief moment of institutional overreach can echo through legal systems and communities long after the immediate crisis has passed.